As a responsible person with growing concerns for your privacy and personal liberty, you want to know where we're headed and what you can do about it. We ask the experts what you need to do to take prudent and responsible action to safeguard your family's wealth and well-being, and what basic first steps will help you to be aware and prepared. ReluctantPreppers.com.
Welcome back, Reluctant Preppers. We're glad to have this distinguished returning guest. Wayne Jett is the author of The Fruits of Graft, Great Depressions Then and Now. We've had him on for a series of interviews, which you'll want to go back and take a look at if you haven't already seen them, laying the historical framework for how the United States has been for over a century in the grips of an elite group of financial and political power individuals who have been engineering destructive economic situations to make sure that the middle class is milked dry and then eliminated so that you can restore a two-class system of easily oppressed workers and a financially empowered elite. And he's back with us to talk with us about some of the more recent developments that may be a turning of the tide in that story. And we're going to circle back with some questions for him that have come from discussions with viewers since his previous interview series here. Wayne, thank you for joining us again here on Reluctant Preppers.
Very happy to be with you, Dunnigan, and you summarized it quite well.
It's chilling, the expose that you led us through and that is covered in your book, The Fruits of Graft, because it really, as we've talked about in our previous interviews, connects realities that many of us have lived through and we've heard our parents or grandparents talk about living through throughout the 20th century and now on into the 21st century. And it was fascinating how you drew the parallels between mechanisms that were used to transfer wealth and self-reliance away from the middle class back in the 1930s and so on during the Great Depression, and then how those same abilities to topple markets and to enact unlawful orchestration of events that could cause the collapse of either, whether it was corporations or entire industries or markets or whatever, happened again in the 1980s, and then again in .com around the year 2000, and then again around 2008. And it's when people see the markets burgeoning once again here in 2018 and wondering how long can this go on. We've certainly seen throughout the entire first quarter of 2018 the markets seeming to stumble and stagger a bit after what was almost an unimaginable upward trajectory for the longest time, with just unnaturally low volatility for the longest period of time, and near record valuations and so on. But if you could circle back with us, because one particular theme that you introduced in our last interview was about, are we in fact going to be witnesses to and perhaps participants in a sort of righting of the ship and an opportunity for justice to reassert itself and for some of these exploitations of the middle class to be put to an end, at least from some of those elite actors that have been doing this over and over again. So could you bring us a little bit up to date on why you see reason for hope in that area, what specific evidence, what sort of string of beads you see lining up that seems to indicate we have reason to think that things are afoot right now, and what those things might be that we should keep our eyes open for?
Well, this whole thing since the 2016 election, presidential election in the United States, has really brought more sharply into focus that campaign, and the events since the election have brought more sharply into focus our real circumstance in the real world, not the phony one that is presented to us by our major media, or their major media, I should say. Let's look back at the basics of their game plan. I mean, they didn't say they just wished us ill and they wished the middle class to go away. They published a manifesto back in 1901 that got very little public attention. But it got the intellectuals' attention. It got the powerful elites' attention. That was its purpose. It was the game plan. Since that time, since 1901, they have pursued that game plan to a T through the United States and elsewhere. It was that they insisted they would go back to a two-class system, the rulers and the slaves. They did not need a middle class, and they did not want any humans on the earth except those necessary to serve them. Their plan was to specifically exterminate all those needed, unwanted humans, and to make certain there was no one in the so-called political middle class, that is, anyone capable of supporting himself or herself. They wanted none of those people existing, only their servants and the rulers themselves. They are still very much dedicated to that plan. In fact, I feel quite confident that they were more than overconfident. In 2016, 18 months ago, that they had it in their hands and they were ready to lower the boom on the rest of the world. It is that serious. I felt it was so in 2016, and I certainly believe it has been so in their minds. They had it so close that they could taste it, and yet all of a sudden we got a miraculous reprieve. Now there are those that do not believe this. They haven't looked closely enough. The man who wrote that manifesto was not shunned from society because he said that the blacks and the yellows and the reds skinned people of the world ought to be exterminated, that the people of the abyss ought to be wiped out of existence. He was invited as the honored guest into the White House of Theodore Roosevelt on the arms of American academics. Yes, the left-wing academics, which were not so numerous and maybe not so powerful at the time as they are now. But nevertheless, that is the plan. This was not simply an idea to make the world into a different way and to have a new world order and to do things differently. It was to wipe out most of humanity. They have had an assiduous, dedicated program ever since that time. They have had 2 major world wars. They have had the so-called influenza of 1918 that wiped out more Americans than all of our wars combined, with a laboratory-made disease that went worldwide, that was spread specifically, with the victim being the military forces, among others, of the United States, spreading it into Spain and then the rest of the world, and coming back over here and wiping out the tremendous numbers of the most able-bodied young people in our country. They were disappointed. I'm sure they were gratified in some extent in doing that kind of an evil, but they were disappointed they couldn't kill more people. But they killed a great many more than the war, World War I was killing, which was a tremendous killing field in itself, wiping out hundreds of thousands of men on single battlefields for no particular purpose. We've gone through that before, but that has to be the mindset that people have to get in mind as to how to evaluate the things that are being done now. It's absolutely just as serious now in the minds of the ruling elite that they want to inflict those kinds of wounds and losses on the rest of us if they can at all do it in any way whatsoever. And there's nothing that they will not reach for and grasp and wield against us as best they can in order to achieve that. What have we got going on right now? We just had a nuclear attack by one militarized country against another just within the last 2 days. There was an attack by the military air forces of the state of Israel against an emplacement in the nation of Syria. The leader of Israel has declared that that was because there was lying on the part of Iran that it had nuclear weapons of some kind or another. Again, as with the chemical attack that was blamed against the government of Syria, I've seen no specific proof of what was in the place that was hit by the bomb that I reputedly saw a picture of, a video of, that looks, for all indications, looks like a nuclear explosion to me. And nuclear explosions do not happen when you bomb a nuclear bomb and the bomb goes off. No, they go off when the trigger of a nuclear weapon is deliberately set off by those that are launching it, not by those who are being attacked by it. So what would the purpose of that be right at this particular nucleus of time? There is a great need on the part of the ruling elite to somehow get out of the trap in which they now find themselves, in which they are being pursued worldwide and are being dug out of their fortresses and their hidey holes. There have been many reports of this that I tend to credit. We've never had such reports in the history of my life. Not since 1901. We have never had an offensive of this kind even intimated by any country. Most certainly not one as powerful as the United States. And as best I can interpret it, I wouldn't be at all surprised if we have important support in this effort by the governments of certain other major countries. Not our normal allies, because our closest allies have been those that have been most closely controlled by the ruling elite. I will say to you that I believe one of those is Great Britain. I would say another one is France. I would say another one is the state of Israel. I would say another one is the government of Saudi Arabia. There have been important changes in some of those governments. Important changes of the same kind, perhaps, that are occurring in the United States government, have occurred in the United States government, but are still occurring. It is a very, very substantial, difficult, complex undertaking when you start reorganizing and redirecting a government that has been taken over by outside forces and has been turned against its own people. And that is most certainly the case that has occurred in the United States. It has been that way, as I've said, since at least 1901. I have gone before into discussions going back far farther than that, when Andrew Jackson in the early 1800s was having to fight the same kind of battles then, but with six-shooters, when now we have cruise missiles and nuclear weapons and bombers of a size that you can hardly imagine. Right. But that's the kind of thing that's going on. And the very fact that we have what I believe is a high-level, most likely team of intelligence operatives, security operatives, not just maybe information gatherers, but people who are operational in terms of their reach and understanding of events, that are very methodically, and I think with a good deal of understanding and planning behind it, so that they can reveal the things that will inform us to some extent and let us be as intelligent as possible as we go through these very, very treacherous and incredibly important days. The way this goes in the next months weeks, days, is likely going to set the pattern of the future of the world for not just the next century, but maybe the next 1,000 years. Because that's how long these people have been ruling the world and doing more and more and more destruction to us with every year that advances and gives them more and more technological power that has them practically at the point of being able to drive everybody crazy with the flip of a switch. This is the kind of thing that is in the balance right now. And yes, there are people who say, I'm just tired of waiting. I just don't believe anything. I don't have faith in anyone. This man who leads the United States has too powerful and too repulsive a personality.
Yeah.
I ask them to please look back at the needs of their families and the experiences of their families and how many they have lost already in these kinds of conflicts and afflictions that have been visited upon the American people. And give another thought to the what I believe is the fact that we have the opportunity now and a champion that is out there risking himself and his family to lead the political fight while the people that are really behind him and persuaded him to run and to do this assured him that they would provide him their best counsel and their best capabilities in terms of handling the military planning that is undoubtedly required to be able to go after these incredibly powerful and dangerous and evil forces that have afflicted our people. Not just people in Africa, not just people in Europe or Asia, the ones that unfortunately our country has been involved in bombing and treating with all kinds of chemicals and so forth. I mean, the people of the United States have been afflicted with this kind of attack. And maybe I need some more light. That might assist a little bit. Seems like
great.
We had that experience last time.
Sure.
But in any event, we need to really take a look and understand that it has not been all sweetness and light for Americans under the stars and stripes all these years. We have had a ruling elite that has controlled the selection of our presidential candidates, controlled our Congress in both houses, has purposely inflicted a depression on us that starved millions of Americans to death. Those are the things that and judgments that I've gone through in terms of my own studies to make sure I knew what I was talking about in regard at least to the Great Depression. And to the things that we have been lied about so many times, so many years, so that it gives me some further judgment, I think, in terms of how to weigh what we're being told now. And my gracious, I never realized in 2011 when my book was published that, my gracious, in 2018 we would have the chance of overcoming this thing that has afflicted and been the scourge of the world for 1,000 years. It's remarkable. But in any event, I'm happy to say that I'm convinced that it is ongoing, and anything I can do to help it along, I want to do it.
I was thinking along the way, these are very serious charges that you level not only throughout your book, which is extremely heavily documented and footnoted, but in conversations we've had since then. These are extremely serious charges that you raise, and corroborating some of those from information that I've had from other speakers that I've attended lectures of, who were extremely well studied, lifelong students of history. For example, one point that you mentioned in passing about the 20th century and the deadliest century in the history of mankind. Not only the major world wars, but people often don't hear about is like the Armenian genocide, which was some people say up to 18 million died there. Talking about the Stalin's genocide of 20 million or so of his own countrymen. In China, perhaps 50 million innocent civilians and other political opponents snuffed out, and that's in addition to all the major epidemic diseases and so on that you've, and when you touch on diseases, I've got to mention to people, we've started a whole sister channel, healingyourself.life, and we've been talking with a number of different medical professionals and others about the sources of what passes for medical care and what passes for health care in our country versus what is really just another extortion of the lifeblood and wealth of working and earning people and to fatten the pockets of those with conflicts of interest. But on the darkest side of that is diseases that are not only cultivated as permanent dependency engines to keep people ill and paying and and basically subject to big pharma and big medicine, but also diseases which reputedly, and there have been multiple sources of this, were engineered either for official supposedly defensive germ warfare preparations or research, but were let loose in the wild and now out there. My wife and I particularly suffering from Lyme disease, which is one of those that's on that list of purportedly weaponized diseases that is very different from what it was in millennia past. But other diseases as well and other exposures. More than 200 experiments on U.S. civilians with chemical sprays by the U.S. military and things like that. So those my mind was just reeling as you went through, because you kind of covered in very broad swaths. And for somebody who hasn't looked into those things, it would be, I would think, tempting to form oh my gosh, this person is just leveling these unsubstantiated, broad brush claims. Oh, where is this person coming from? And it's like, wait a minute, if people will just slow it down and start checking into and actually do some research in these areas, they may be quite sobered by what they find. Another one you just mentioned in passing was the how close we came to the precipice in 2016 in the election, and all people would need to look at is the media coverage of both the previous several elections leading up to that, as well as the who was covered who was on the cover page of all the major publications and on the news, who made it through the so-called primaries and got nominated at the so-called conventions of the major parties, and what huge forces were arrayed against anyone who was a populist candidate on either side, so that the chosen ones could be coronated, and what an upset it was. And then when the Trump upset occurred, what convulsions and conniptions and not only the mainstream media players, but also others in the entertainment industry and throughout have been in ever since that moment. I mean, there were weeks and weeks of not only demonstrations, but people doing needing safe spaces and cry outs and leaving they couldn't do their job and so on. And then more recently we've been hearing about when anyone comes to lecture on campuses, people being told they can't have those lecturers come because it creates an unsafe environment, and now supposedly a shadow government operating within, as far as Obama staying over in Washington and trying people not only in Congress but throughout the career bureaucrats actually working to undermine any progress, any appointees, any progress by the Trump administration. So I'm not saying I'm an expert on any of this stuff, and I'm not saying that all of this is the only side of the story, but I just encourage people, as you have, to not dismiss the serious claims that you're stating, but instead to look into them with an open spirit of inquiry. So that brings us. Go ahead.
I've said for some time on a number of occasions that it's not possible for a normal person to change his worldview based on hearing something from someone else, such as myself. You have to dig deeply and be willing to look closely and look and dig in every corner to make sure that you understand the facts that you can believe and that you know to be the case. And you just can't do that. I mean, you can't persuade yourself in your own mind that you have to start looking at things completely differently because you happen to watch a video or bump into someone and he told you something that just really was way out there or something of the sort. Because you can't just redo all of your values and all of your judgments that you've made your whole life about what really makes the world work. In order to, and I think that a very large part of that makeup of the psyche of Americans has been the stories they've been told about the Great Depression and the things that the awfully difficult times that people had to live through and what happened. And the most overriding aspect of what they're told about it is that the U.S. government did just all they could to try to make it better and to try to make it go away and to alleviate the starvation and so forth. And that is absolutely false. I've, as I said, demonstrated it in my book, but other people just can't believe all of that and really digest it and answer the questions that would come up in anyone else's mind as they try to pass it along, unless they really understand what happened and look at each of the actions and each of the things and their effects and just how those things came about in the particular case, and according to the plan that I've told you about, in which they really are out to destroy a large part of humanity, including Americans. America has been, in some respects, a major tool of those ruling elite, relying upon the willingness of our good people, good men and women, volunteering to fight on behalf of what's called freedom, but in many cases, too many cases, on contrived, made-up causes, upon false flags and faked lies and circumstances of bringing us into war that has been for the purpose of stealing assets from other countries or destroying lives or putting other people in power in different places according to the plan of the ruling elite, not according to what is right and good or necessary for the well-being of Americans. So in those circumstances, I'm just sharing with you for a few minutes the best judgment I can make in terms of being honest about the way I evaluate things. I can't provide my opinion to everyone and say, your opinion ought to be the same as mine. It only should be when you get around to understanding these various things in such a way that you make your own evaluation and you look at the right places and you make the judgments about there are with people who are so, for example, impatient to see something happen, nothing's going on and so forth. A great deal has been going on all this year and the past 18 months. There are literally hundreds of major executives who have already resigned from their jobs.
Yep.
There are many high-level politicians that would never have given up their positions, and they're giving them up. They're doing so because they have already learned that their crimes are known and that there's going to be retribution. No, they can't do them all at one time, and doing them one at a time and present the evidence without being ready in all circumstance to spring the actions that will bring us up to where we need to be when there is this much widespread criminality and evil that has worked its way into our American system. The last creditable statement I've heard about the number of sealed indictments in the last 18 months is now up to 25,500. Now, have I seen any of those? No, I have not. But the people who are talking about these things and reporting them as fact, I give credit to in terms of their willingness to involve themselves closely enough to know what's going on and to risk their own safety in order to report it. And those things are very important. It's important for us to know what is going on. I think our most urgent problem right this minute is to see that we do not have a shooting nuclear war between the major powers. And that is precisely what these ruling elite are trying to arrange in every way they have. They've tried a number of places. They were using North Korea. That tool has been removed from their power. There's only one way that the unification of those leaders, just in terms of their initial meeting, ever occurred. 2 years ago, it would be unheard of. And yet it's already occurred now. It is because the underpinnings of control over North Korea and South Korea through the ruling elite have been removed. If the ruling elite still rule there would still be an highly antagonistic North Korea used as a tool to threaten other nations with nuclear attack. That is a tool of the ruling elite. The fact that they have now come forward means that the ruling elite has lost that lever. I think they're in the process of perhaps going to lose levers in other parts of the world as well, just as important, if not more so. I would say, if anything, more so. And so in those circumstances, we may well see in coming months, and maybe years, but I don't think it's going to be that long, the change of major governments and ruling powers in those major governments that have so many years pretended to be benevolent ruling elites, royalties, while they have been as evil as we can imagine them to be. And sooner the better, as far as I'm concerned.
If people want to understand better what you're describing, Wayne, and what major changes may be likely to happen in the next, for example, year or two, are there sources, places of learning, places of researching, places of understanding? Because you've got your own lifetime studies of context and so on to fall back on that give you this gut sense, a reality check when you get exposed with new information. For example, you just in the last couple minutes here mentioned the thawing of relations with North Korea as being not just, that's just a particular circumstance that's disconnected from other things, but you saw a deeper significance to that. If people want to understand better how to interpret and how to understand what they're seeing unfolding in the outside world, where are some places that you'd recommend that they could turn to try to get better perspective, better information than what they're being spoon-fed on the corporate media?
Well, it depends on your circumstances and how much time you can devote to it and so forth. But certainly in terms of getting a place to ground yourself, in terms of the role the ruling elite has played in so many nations, and especially in the United States for the last 100 years and more. I mean, my book, I put 5 or 6 years into that. And I did so because, I can't explain all these things within the time that people have to allow orally and try to organize the information. But reading, I think, is much more. But in terms of current events, there are tremendous places. As badly as these major service providers have acted during this critical time, these service providers on the internet in many ways have been just as controlled by the ruling elite. They certainly have been, just as the major media are. Even though they have been more or less co-opted by producers such as yourself, putting real information out, and then they have to go to the trouble of censoring you or somehow cutting you off from the ability to either be compensated by advertising or things of that sort. Well, in any event, those kinds of things, it's a gold mine now to have the internet and so many different producers who are really looking for good information. It takes some time, and also it takes some judgment in terms of who makes sense and who's trustworthy and who isn't. But those are the kinds of things that you have to look into rather than turning on the television. I mean, I just don't do it any longer, and I think I feel a lot better for it. Sometimes I look to see maybe a little bit of what they're still saying, but it's pretty predictable. And there are a great many sources of information. And again, once you get yourself going in terms of what's credible and what's not, it really is a much better informed perspective to have about what our prospects are. I think if I just watched television and read a newspaper, I would feel pretty despondent at this point. With people who, although you look at some rallies here and there, and you can see through it right now that there are plenty of people out there that have high hopes, and some of the impatience is because of people having high hopes. They're ready to see some real results, and I think we're going to. I'm very positive in that regard.
We have been talking with Wayne Jett. He is the author of Fruits of Graft and Great Depressions Then and Now. He's been with us here on Reluctant Preppers talking to us about themes from history of the United States in particular, but the whole world, that are coming to a head here in our current era, and that we need to stay vigilant and keep our eyes open. Wayne, you issued a short article this week about that. Could you please tell people where they can find that article and find your other writings?
I have a website called classicalcapital.com, classicalcapital.com, and you'll see on my homepage there. Actually, I need to thin it out some because I've got the pieces I've written for the last 2 or 3 years still on the home page. But I have archives in prior years as well, as some essays and things of that sort. And so they can find my book and other things as well. But in any event, I'm very pleased to have the kind of information. I don't claim to have direct sources in the intelligence community or anything of the sort. But I look in places where I've found people that I think are trustworthy, and you're one of them as well. And I want to thank you for having me on. I'm always happy to have the chance to discuss. One of my problems has been I didn't find YouTube as soon as I should have. I kept trying to rely upon radio. I even tried television. Not a single entity trying on television willing to. There was one closed circuit television station in Los Angeles that actually interviewed me at one point some years back. But they would much rather spend their time interviewing our former FBI director and people like that who get these publishing things and get very wealthy on this From my end of things, if you want to tell the kind of information I'm providing, don't plan to make a living doing it. It's not that kind of circumstance.
Well, I'm kind of in the same boat, Wayne. If I could produce cute dog videos, I think I'd be out ahead from where I am right now, because that seems to be what YouTube considers advertiser friendly. We even had, you mentioned, it's absolutely true, approximately half of our videos that we publish are get flagged and marked as non-advertiser friendly and in violation of their guidelines within sometimes minutes to hours of going live, and I have to wait for them to go through their appeal process, and finally they get set back, days later after you've missed your real chance to make any revenue off it as okay, I guess it's been even ones including talking about nutrition, talking about gardening. It's just it's unbelievable sometimes. But anyway, this one will certainly be, I suppose, set off the alarm bells of controversy, and we'll have to go through the same thing again. But we're talking soberly about important topics here in a way that it opens up people's opportunity to go do their own research. And we're just grateful always for you visiting us here on Reluctant Preppers. Thank you, Wayne.
Thank you, Duncan.